Friends, when we think of Yoga Nidrā as a horizontal meditation, we're challenging some quite big ideas about what meditation looks like. Because usually meditation looks like something vertical. And when we try to understand why it is that maybe Yoga Nidrā got a little bit dropped out of the consciousness of what yoga practice is in contemporary terms, it might be to do with the fact that horizontal meditation takes a lot less physical effort than vertical meditation. It takes a great deal of focus not to fall asleep, although that can be part of the practice also, to drift in and drift out. But so there's an interesting paradox at play, and I want to explore a little piece about the history of Yoga Nidrā and whether it's a state that can be recognized as completely effortless, or whether it's a state that actually requires quite some considerable efforts to remain conscious, or maybe to place in there particular practices, like something called a Sankalpa, which might be to focus power on a desired outcome that might be very deeply called by the earth herself. So to understand how it is that this horizontal meditation is not the first thing people think of when they think of yoga. When people think of yoga, they think of asana, they think of postures, they might think of pranayama, breathing practices, they might think of forceful practices of kriyas and pumping breaths and mudras and bandhas, gestures and locks in the body. And all of these things are part of the many, many, many different types of technique that are all part of Hatha Yoga. So the yoga that uses the body, right, with these postures and breathing practices. But a horizontal meditation doesn't usually feature in many people's understanding of what they think yoga is, unless you track back into the 1100s and a text called the Amanaska. So it's a yogic text, yogic guidance text, called the Amanaska. And also if you look in around 1400, there's a text called the Yoga Tārāvalī. And both of these texts were highlighted by a scholar called Jason Birch, and he was working at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the Yogic Studies project, which published a lot of excellent texts and translations about the history of yoga and about lost texts, things that had got forgotten about in the kind of general history of yoga. So what Jason Birch has done really helpfully is to draw attention to these two particular texts, the 1100 text of the Amanaska and the Yoga Tārāvalī. And in these texts, Yoga Nidrā, the state of Yoga Nidrā, is clearly identified as an effortless state, one that requires no effort, but beyond that even is actually about a state of being without any intention. And that's important because intentionlessness, the intention of not having any intention, is kind of an intention of its own. But in the state of Yoga Nidrā, it's about a surrender and a letting go of any kind of conscious focus that you might bring in. Now, clearly, doing this in a horizontal meditation is quite a different thing when you sit up. So, the horizontal meditation, which is Yoga Nidrā, can absolutely include this state of effortless being. Because the only effort that's required is the effort to make the time to stop for long enough, to lie down and let these things, these natural states of Yoga Nidrā arise. So what Jason Birch pointed out is that in the Amanaska, the yogic welcoming of this state of intentionlessness is called Nirvikalpa. And what this means is it means being without any conscious focus for directing the thoughts or the intentions. And clearly, the process of lying down to allow this to happen, to get into the state of Yoga Nidrā, is something that you choose to do, but the intention is that you abandon that choice and let things unfold as they are, so that pretty much everything becomes part of the practice. Everything that comes into the field of consciousness, whatever is heard, whatever is tasted, whatever is sensed, whatever is felt, is part of the practice. And there's no intention to eradicate those things or keep the focus to kind of blinker it. You get a very similar kind of thing he points out in a text called the Yoga Tārāvalī. And there's this kind of sense that these experiences of consciously stepping out of being directive about our intention allows for the yogin, the one who is practicing the yoga, in the state of Yoga Nidrā, to access what we discovered in the first module was the original state of Yoga Nidrā, which is limitlessly creative, but in this state of deep restfulness that allows that creativity to birth within us. So isn't that an amazing thing? So that we can resolve to become without effort and to allow whatever arises to be part of the practice. And this is possibly why it is that a lot of folk who practice yoga either have never heard of Yoga Nidrā or it's taught to them in a very different way, because it doesn't quite fit this effortlessness, this intentionlessness, this just let it all unfold. That doesn't quite fit with the idea that you're very focused on how many of the practices you do and how you control your breath and how you control your body and how you take charge of the life force. So one way to understand this is that that's possibly why people don't really place Yoga Nidrā right at the center of the history of yoga or the key features of what yoga practice might look like, because it doesn't quite fit within this idea that yoga is an act of will, that you choose to do these practices, to develop the skills and the capacity to meditate vertically, which is, part of the final intention of yoga, is to be so comfortable that you can sit and meditate like that in a vertical sense. So when we actually widen our perspective a little bit and think, well, actually, the Yoga Nidrā state is essentially and of its nature a practice that doesn't have any effort, because you're just lying there and being held and by the earth and witnessing what happens, then clearly that's an important part of the yoga practice. It's actually the balance to all the effort that goes on is this relaxed way of being with whatever is. And what you see sometimes is that relaxed way of being with whatever is used by some yoga schools and some Yoga Nidrā techniques to install a very deliberate and conscious resolve, which is called a Sankalpa, that actually uses that effortlessness in order to kind of create effort, to create focus. And two slightly different, well, actually, they're two very different things. And what's important to understand is that you can do that with Yoga Nidrā. You can be in a horizontal meditation that's effortless and bring in desired focuses for healing or for particular projects or for meditative focus. But you can also not do that. And when we look at the older versions of Yoga Nidrā, the more ancient forms, the forms that are described in the Mahabharata, they resonate much more coherently with what's described in the Amanaska and the Yoga Tārāvalī as this state of being without any intention.
Find out more on advaya.life.